Pessimism and cynicism. I've been an environmental activist my whole life, and I know where pessimism and cynicism leads, and and I know that we're up against impossible odds. Uh, and I also know that the solutions are actually readily available. And so, with the appropriate consciousness shift, um, we actually could resolve the climate crisis in the span in a 20-year span. You know, we could very, and the solution that almost nobody seems to talk about is not the Paris Accords. It's the biodiversity conference and convention and the One Earth proposal that they're going to be taking up internationally next year. That if we get, if what we were talking about earlier about going through those stages, and the next one being reparations with indigenous peoples and acknowledging their trauma, right? If we get to that by next, I think, September of 2021, the United Nations and all the countries of the world will be considering adopting this One Earth proposal, which is a fancy way of saying asking Mother Earth to help us resolve her climate trauma, which is our trauma.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. All right, here's the challenge, especially for many of the doomers in the audience, is to listen to both part one, this is part one, and part two of this interview series with Zhiwa Woodbury. It promises to be a feather ruffler for us all, and quite possibly a source of inspiration and maybe even some healing. Zhiwa Woodbury. Just in looking forward to speaking with you, I reminded myself of the many writings that I've collected in your file. I have files for so many folks that I refer to for this body of work I'm putting together. And it's just remarkable. And it's really moving to me when I get to look at what you've written. So often it just goes right into my heart, right into what's really mattering a great deal to me. And I just, I feel very lucky to be talking with you and looking forward to it.
Did you read Kurt Vonnegut when you were growing up?
I did a little bit.
Did you ever read Slaughterhouse-Five?
I did.
Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. That's how I have felt most of my life. And, like Planetary Hospice was sort of a paper that I just kind of channeled, that had just been going around in my head for so long.
Yeah. And
now I feel like we're finally living in Planetary Hospice. And 5 years ago, I wrote that book on climate grief and and processing our climate grief, and now that's topical. And but people still haven't quite got to the point culturally, they still haven't got to the point where they're recognizing, oh, this is all trauma through and through. It's like with Black Lives Matter, not like we should probably just get started, but seeing that as we're still not, we still haven't really gotten to indigenous propriety and rights. We've gone from misogyny to to Black Lives Matter necessarily, which raises, the whole issue of oppression. which is causing the which has caused the climate crisis,
Yeah.
and preventing us from solving it. And I think then, once, like, we're getting to the point where even with what we're seeing in the streets right now, with the Black Lives Matter, like, how is that not a trauma narrative? How are we not applying the trauma narrative to that? I mean, really, because it opens it up to so much, such a great potential for healing. We're doing it, like, we're doing it without acknowledging it, by talking about Civil War monuments, symbols and blah, 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 but, and slavery and reparations, finally getting to reparations, right? And the common narrative fabric for that and the climate crisis is the same. It's the trauma that we've caused and are continuing to unjustifiably cause to people of color.
Yeah. Yeah.
It does. It really, because if you treat people like that, why wouldn't you treat the planet like that and species like that and blah, blah, like so it really is appearing as a trauma sphere more and more. And also, now we're finally moving into planetary hospice and the great dying.
Yeah. Well, when Carolyn and I, a couple of years back, did that trauma online symposium, and you joined us there, I think you were
the collective trauma.
Sorry?
The collective trauma center? Oh, no. You're talking about something else.
Well, you came in and joined us. I was just going to mention
right. Yeah.
Healing our trauma together.
Yeah.
In an insane world. And you wrote that paper to just kind of summarize your experience of being a part of that. And just like what you're describing right now, you have this ability to kind of pave the way for those of us who might not be quite as quick on the uptake as you are. I think for that particular symposium and that particular thread, you were pretty far ahead of certainly public awareness of just how the fabric of trauma and shared trauma, collective trauma, how it so
bringing all this up.
It's the backdrop to everything we are experiencing. Everything.
So, like, why is everything accelerating? Because it has to. Because we're not doing anything.
Yeah. So I guess where I'm curious now, because I'll put links to all these writings in the show notes, so people can catch up if they're not aware of your writing and your thinking. I'm curious. I don't know how it is for you. Just to briefly check in from over here, I'm having daily expansion sessions, stretching sessions of what I consider to be a pretty formidable capacity in myself to be present to pretty large scale waves of stress. And like in the past couple of days, the thing that has just literally dropped my jaw. I haven't seen myself with this kind of a drip by drip capacity kind of test in my own system. But the news of not just 2, not just 3, but I think it's up to 5 now of suspected lynchings. And I'm telling you, man, I don't know. I have such large scale waves of almost every major emotion in my body and my system at one point or another, and I can literally only let in drips of what it is to really feel the implications of that and the energetics of that. So I'm sharing this just to let you know what I'm feeling these days. And I'm also so curious, what's got your attention, and what are you seeing? What are you feeling? What are you noticing in the world? What are the waves that catch your attention? I'm just really curious because you always have something um, pretty remarkable to make note of.
Well, first of all, let me acknowledge what you and so many others are feeling and going through, and to thank you for bearing social witness that way. I think that that's kind of I guess if you were to sort of name the common meme right now in the world, I think it is bearing social witness is probably it, because we're all doing it in our own ways, and it's like you say, it's testing all of our capacities. Some of us are out front, trying to uh, perform a function of public dialogue, and like yourself and Carolyn and Thomas Hubel and like so many others. And I first just want to say how deeply I appreciate that, because I know from having done years of hospice, and like I know what it's like to be on the sort of front line.
Yeah,
And when you're aware, when you have awareness, it doesn't matter if you're in Zen hospice or on the streets protesting, or in a studio recording podcasts and so forth. Um, you feel it. I mean, you feel it. It's the same thing that we're all feeling, right? The same um, uh, challenging acceleration of social forces and cultural forces and economic forces, and you know it's all, we're facing into the storm basically, and it's growing in intensity and challenging us all. So I am sort of more of a recluse, I'm it's because I appreciate the things that people like you are doing, and Thomas Hubel and others, uh, and Extinction Rebellion, that I'm always so happy to just accept an invitation to talk, because most of the rest of the time, especially with COVID crisis and the lockdown, I am basically living the life of a monk. And that's my way of facing the storm, is spending hours a day in meditation and walks in nature, and really a privileged existence, very simple right now. I mean, that's how I've got to a point where I can do that, apart from just living long enough that the government starts giving you money, curiously enough. But uh, yeah, simplify my life to accord with what I feel like we're all being asked to do in the world. Um, and and then for me, it's a feeling. There's still this tension between a feeling of isolation, and I think especially this is true for us boomers, because we're at high risk, and the other people that have Lyme disease and things like that are at high risk for COVID. I don't want anything to do with it. I don't want any part of of the COVID virus. I have too much respect for it. And I'm still listening to my mother telling me to stay in my room and think about what I'm doing. And so I sort of see that as my role, is so many other people are just already, out there, and we're in this intense phase of bargaining, with the world that we've lost and people that want it back. and the people that are saying, hell no. There's this incredible collective bargaining phase that we're going through in our COVID collective trauma. The pandemic has brought on this collective trauma. Um, and we're at least past the shock and denial of the early, when it first hit here in the States, which pretty much when it was hitting everywhere else but China. And then the anger, that, I mean, at first, like with 9/11, when everybody first locked down, everybody was so kind and considerate to each other. And there was like, hey, isn't it cool? Like, there's no planes in there. And everybody was like, oh, and this is kind of what we need to do to respond to the climate crisis too, isn't it? And, we went through this nice little phase, and then all of a sudden people started getting angry. The next phase or stage of grief is at a cultural level as collective anger. And so people started, there was just a lot of anger, and we have a president who's an angry and chief kind of guy anyhow, triggering all of that. But somehow that led into this immense bargaining phase that we're in the midst of, which is, as I said, just as when you lost a loved one, or you yourself are in the process of losing your life, at first there's the, no, this can't be happening, then the anger, and then, well, please let me live, and I promise that I'll go to church every Sunday, or
Right.
I'll do that Dharma retreat that I've always, or I'll be better to my children. That sort of bargaining phase is really what we're seeing at a cultural level right now. And in an environment of just increasing chaos.
Mm-hmm.
And so the rise of, in that tinderbox, yet another live murder of a human being who a policeman didn't see as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And just like Arab Spring with the fruit merchant, fruit vendor self-immolating, that was in a oppressive climate enough to set off Arab Spring. And so with the murder of George Floyd, it was the catalyst for an immense trauma to come into full fruition. And it happened first in Minneapolis, but then quickly spread, just like the virus, quickly spread over the entire planet, where everybody was saying, this is not who we are. This is not who we want to be. Maybe, it is who we are, but this is not who we want to be, and it's not acceptable. And that level of awareness and acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement is ongoing, is incredibly encouraging. To me, this is how you actually recover from climate trauma, one step at a time, but also with this sort of quantum change in public consciousness. That's what we've been saying for years. That's what needs to happen. There has to be a change in consciousness at the collective level for us to actually address the existential crisis of global warming and ecological biodiversity, et cetera.
Yeah.
And we're seeing it in quantum jumps, first with the Me Too movement and addressing patriarchy, and now the Black Lives Matter movement, addressing slavery. But we need to come back to that because, it's more than that. It's much more than that. And then we have to we have to go through a similar quantum jump in our relationship with indigenous peoples all over the world. And they too, like Black Lives Matter, have been rising and making their voices heard and being recognized institutionally, such as by the United Nations, and saying, wow, they were right all along. we
Right.
thought they were primitive or whatever, but these people are actually have a lot to teach us, but we haven't addressed the trauma there yet.
Right.
And that trauma of the indigenous people, I think that's when we get to that step, that's going to be sort of the key step, because that is the living organism. They are the representatives of the living organism that is Gaia, that is the entire planet. They speak for her. And so when we come into a discussion, we'll be in a discussion of reparations with African Americans here, and then hopefully that will at the same time lead to treating countries of color the same way we're thinking about people of color right now. We could level that up to look at what we're doing into the global South, which is mostly Black countries and brown, and then start talking about, well, what about reparations for indigenous people who are basically still being, like Black Lives Matter, are still being executed around the world every couple of weeks. And now with the coronavirus, you know, they're dealing with countries like Brazil and Bolsonaro who have already practiced biological warfare on them. And so they're facilitating and sort of, you know, bringing, so all of that is boiling right now.
Yeah.
So another kind of chaos that's going to, at some point, have a catalyst that will trigger a global conscious shift and saying this is not acceptable. Mm-hmm. That's when, you know, we turn to Gaia herself. You know, once we start getting into that reparations and resolution of trauma on all those different sort of levels, culturally and historically, and you know, then we will finally sort of, I think, have that awareness that we have to we not only have to live in peace with each other, we all have to express that in the way that we're treating the earth, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not there yet, but we're getting close. We're you know, we're only in the bargaining phase of this trauma, which means that once the second wave, well, many people say we haven't left the first wave yet, but once we're back in lockdown again, probably between now and a couple of months from now, probably worse then, that's the depression. That's when the depression stage kicks in for collective grief. And that's the fruitful darkness, you know. That's when at the individual level, you begin to realize, oh, this is really happening. It's not accepted yet, but it's like, oh, this is really happening. And so that's truthfulness, whereas in the bargaining stage right now, there's still a lot of denial.
Yeah. Well, I very much appreciate your kind of mapping us from here through an imagined near future when we've gone through a couple more of fairly accepted stages of grief and acknowledging great loss and so on. And do you mind if I throw in a kind of I don't really know what to call it, just a wingnut other framing?
I'm used to arguing before judges, so go ahead, just throw it. That's what they're famous for doing. Only you're not wearing a black robe.
Right.
I I wish, I dream for the kind of smooth, relatively smooth and predictable sailing through some chapters or stages of grief and loss that you were just talking about.
There's nothing smooth about it. It's
Well, but
it's
compared to what I'm about to ask,
yeah.
it's pretty fucking smooth.
It's rough. It's just the psychology of it, you know.
Yeah, I understand. But another part of the psychology is really where I'm curious what we might come up with together in looking at, what's the shadow version of that progression, and how is that shadow present right now? Because just the word bargaining, there's a shadow aspect of bargaining that's going on in particularly the proto-fascist countries, the here in Brazil and all that, in which it's really not about bargaining. It's about ramming the shadow laden expression of the most dominant and oppressive version of what's gotten us here to the next level, and really saying this is what we're committed to, and clearly, without having to dig at all anymore, what that means is we're willing to have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands die. And those people right there, and those people right there, and what the hell, throw in a few of those people right there. And then I still want to stay with the progression you were talking about, because I think it's dead on accurate, is that unfortunately the earth is coming in at last place. And all I've been able to see since I've been really in this body of work and moving forward in it is we are a death cult. And the only thing that can happen with the predatory capitalism that is our way of being is that we have to suck out the life from our host. We have no choice but to kill it. So I wanted to put out that shadow expression and just see if you had anything to bounce off of that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, death and rebirth is always messy. Birth itself is messy. Um, what the way things play out on a global stage is incredibly messy. You know, I think it's why we watch things like Game of Thrones, to see something that's even more messy than than what we're dealing with on the news. Uh, but so first of all, okay, start from where we are. Um, a week or two ago, it looked like we were on the verge of civil war. It looked like Trump was declaring war,
Mm-hmm.
or about formally to declare war on the American people. And obviously, he's bringing out all the crazies that have been hiding in the mountains or whatever, or in their basements, that are in love with their guns, you know. Um, the death cult. There's the death cult, right? All the hateful groups that are waiting for civil war to happen, or the end of the world to happen, or Armageddon to happen, you know, because they fancy themselves survivors or something. But it did.
Actually, if I could, I would just like to add another population to the death cult idea, because it's
Yeah,
not necessarily just those guys. They're really easy to point at.
right.
They're absolutely exemplars. But I'm also talking about the death cult that has been driving the propaganda, the controlled narrative of everything's just fine. We're going to continue to do whatever we're going to do.
Right.
And you can send out all the Greta Thunbergs you want. You can start up all the XRs you want. and we're going to mow right over you. So, we're going to have Obama become the greatest producer of American oil ever.
Yeah.
And then we're going to call him an environmental president, and so on. It's the also a twisted kind of
Yeah, then we're going to make you miss him.
right, right.
um,
So it's more than just the very obvious, very immediately violent death cult. It's also the death cult that has controlled the narrative to such a degree that we are consistently voting against our best interest, and we have no idea what we don't know. We don't know what we don't know about how self-destructive and ecocidal we are. So
we're
I
both, though. I mean, we're both human. We're along the spectrum of like one of my teachers says, humans are the only species that is capable of the most horrific, terrible things like the Holocaust and all of that, and also at the same time the most loving and compassionate, like sacrifice and stuff. Um, and it is all playing out. But what's interesting about that right now is the narrative that you're speaking to is the narrative that seems to be disintegrating, you know, and um, those powers that be, like the oil powers, they're of course they're making they're clinging on to the power that they've always enjoyed, and the future that they feel like they are entitled to, and so forth. But there, it appears to all be coming. So so first of all, let me address it this way. First of all, what I've always been convinced about is that that our ecological systems, the of the larger organism, Gaia has this amazing ecology that covers the planet with my mycelium layers of intelligence. And okay, that is a very, as Thoreau said, I've seen the foundations of the earth and I'm confident that it's going to last a while. And the economy, on the other hand, is like this casino house of cards, a casino made of cards. Is that such a thing? And it's not very, we've seen it like sputter and halt, a couple of times in very recent memory. And now it's this, we're watching this, like that's the bargaining, that's what's fascinating about the bargaining. All of those interests, like Bolsonaro and Trump and the hate groups and everything, are police, are all making a last stand. It's ever since Trump, I really feel like when Trump marched across the White House lawn with his daughter Ivanka carrying a Bible in her designer purse or whatever, and stood there, like that whole walk, the whole world watched, and even here in the US went, oh my God, he's naked. He has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes. It's like, it was so obvious. Like, I almost wanted to, yeah, you almost want to thank the guy for putting such a honest face on the aggression
yeah.
and corruption that has controlled us for so long. And
Yeah.
that so we're so the economy I feel is destined to collapse. Like, they put in all this sort of life support for it. There's this great optimism in the corporate world. For some reason, the Wall Street just keeps rejoicing at all the misery. Like, oh great, the world is more miserable, we're only going to make more money, right? But if the virus will bring us to our knees if we do the wrong thing, we know that. And so we sort of know that's going to happen. And then many economists, many economists that have been right all along are like, we're heading into a greater depression. It might not happen next month. It's going to maybe start happening next year, but definitely over the next 2 to 5 years, that economic structure is going to come crumbling down.
Yeah.
And the disparity of wealth. So then you have, let me share, because it's right on point here, a passage from Amitav Ghosh, The Great Derangement. He's a fiction writer and wrote a book about how difficult it is to write about climate issues. He's from India. Okay, and so this is from 2016. And listen to how current this is, right? The fact is that we live in a world that has been profoundly shaped by empire and its disparities. Differentials of power between and within nations are probably greater today than they have ever been. These differentials are in turn closely related to carbon emissions. The distribution of power in the world therefore lies at the core of the climate crisis. This is indeed one of the greatest obstacles to mitigatory action, and all the more so because it remains largely unacknowledged. And then I'm going to skip down just a little bit here. He says, it is for these reasons that I differ with those who identify capitalism as the principal fault line on the landscape of climate change. It seems to me that this landscape is riven by two interconnected but equally important rifts, each of which follows a trajectory of its own. These are capitalism and empire, the latter being understood as an aspiration to dominance on the part of some of the most important structures of the world's most powerful states. In short, even if capitalism were to be magically transformed tomorrow, the imperatives of political and military dominance would remain a significant obstacle to progress on mitigatory action on the climate crisis. So the key to this is that this is 2016, and he's saying the problem is nobody's acknowledging this. We're all just talking about, science and fossil fuels and acting like there's a technical fix or something, And in reality, as I heard an 11-year-old girl from Britain tell John Bendel on his most recent broadcast, it's about oppression. It's almost like it's about oppression, stupid. I mean, she didn't say that, but it reminds me of that political slogan. It's the economy, stupid. I've been trying to provide all along the narrative subtext here that what we're experiencing is trauma, climate trauma. This is what when you say all the problems are rooted in oppression, and now we have people taking over downtown Seattle and, abolishing police departments. We have people in the street right now demanding to have these conversations, especially with old white guys like you and me, that you can't separate the climate crisis out from oppression of people of color, oppression of countries of color, oppression of the global South, where you take all of the resources from, leave us spoiled lands, and then refuse to do anything about, and then when we have to leave our homes because of the climate crisis, you build walls and put us on islands and, and treat us like we're not humans. Like, what else, where else is this happening but in the streets of Minneapolis or every large city in America? But what about, the island of Lesbos off of Greece, where they have concentration camps basically for climate refugees? All of Europe, is like rising up in support of America and Americans in the street for oppressing Black lives, while they refuse to let climate refugees from Africa come into their country. So who's oppressing who? Right? And so this is the thing, is that it has to be acknowledged in order for us to finally start to agree on solutions and have recovery. You can't recover from trauma, or you can't recover from trauma until you acknowledge it. And obviously, if oppression of people and countries of color and the earth and species, of course, as well, is the real issue, not how many miles I'm driving my car or whatever, or not like the Paris Accords, not like our levels of omission, bringing our levels of emissions down. No, it's attacking the systemic problems that have gotten us into this mess. And that all begins and ends with oppression by the powerful few of the many, right? And has that ever been more apparent and extreme than it is right now? So what I started to say originally in response to your question was, a couple of weeks ago, it looked like we were on the verge of civil war. And come November, it might look like that again. But somehow we're in this, again, we seem to stepping into new worlds where the old rules are no longer applying, that level of chaos. And somehow all the tricks of the politicians, the police departments themselves, everything that they've always assumed that they can get away with, they're not getting away with it. And so hopefully then that leads us, once you start addressing that systemic problem at a level of the United States, which is both the problem and the greatest potential for solution of the climate crisis, because it's the American dream that we've imposed on the world. Once you start addressing that, once you start pulling those threads out, the whole fabric starts coming apart, right? So that's kind of what seems to be happening now. Is like we're finally pulling those threads out, and the fabric seems to be disintegrating before our eyes. So of course, all the forces of darkness are quite angry about it, and they haven't had the last, we haven't heard the last from them. But what's amazing is it seems like maybe for the first time, really, the oppressed, the forces that are being oppressed are gaining the upper hand. That's what it feels like, isn't it? Like there's been a fundamental pivot where that all the institutional forces that have continued, like Standing Rock, like putting dogs on people and stuff like that, hiring BlackRock to oppress, and the states going around trying to pass laws to make protests illegal, to make like all of that nonsense seems to have flipped, where people are like, no, this is not acceptable, and we're all in agreement. It's not a black issue. It's more of a white issue actually than it is a black issue, because we're the ones that have to, because we're the ones that still have the privilege and the implicit political power, I think, to change things for the better.
Right.
It's fascinating right now. And and then you have Jane Goodall, who is like, a saint. And she is, right? I mean, she's like Mother Earth. I mean, we should just call Jane Goodall Mother Earth. That would be a great thing. Saying people of privilege have a moral obligation to be optimistic about solutions to the climate crisis because they have the opportunity that people that are oppressed and species do not have. So as a person of privilege, and I consider myself incredibly privileged, even though I'm not in the 1% or whatever, we have the opportunity to talk about things like this, even is a privilege. There are countries where you're not allowed to have such conversations. But yeah, I feel that more. I feel the moral force of that statement by her, someone that has lived in nature, lived so close to Mother Nature, that pessimism and cynicism. I've been an environmental activist my whole life, and I know where pessimism and cynicism leads, and I know that we're up against impossible odds. And I also know that the solutions are actually readily available. And so, with the appropriate consciousness shift, we actually could resolve the climate crisis in the span in a 20-year span. We could and the solution that almost nobody seems to talk about is not the Paris Accords. It's the biodiversity conference and convention and the One Earth proposal that they're going to be taking up internationally next year. That if what we were talking about earlier about going through those stages, and the next one being reparations with indigenous peoples and acknowledging their trauma, right? If we get to that by next, I think, September of 2021, the United Nations and all the countries of the world will be considering adopting this One Earth proposal, which is a fancy way of saying asking Mother Earth to help us resolve her climate trauma, which is our trauma. The science of ecology is there. We're always talking about the science of climate science, right? But we have to get carbon out of the atmosphere to avert the worst, consequences of global warming. There's too much carbon already up there. It's not all been taken up. And the way you do that actually is by very surprising and natural ways, of restoring grasslands and kelp forests and mangroves, and leaving the whales alone, because the whales are a keystone species in the ocean and perform an amazing function of drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. Mother Nature is just standing by, after all the abuse that we've heaped on her, waiting for us to say, okay, let's turn it around now and start protecting keystone species in particular bioregions where people live and where people don't live. And so the science is there, all figured out by that assumes that we're going to continue to be laggardly in getting off of fossil fuels. So they're assuming that we're not going to achieve the Paris Accords for another 20 or 30 years, like by 2050. Then they say, what would it take to draw all that carbon out of the atmosphere? And basically what it takes is it's free. It's free technology, working with local bioregions. They've broken it all the way down to the bioregional level. And then it's just a matter of identifying keystone species and what does it take to restore. Although a third of it's already functioning fine, we just have to leave it alone, just like with the whales. So, the reason we're not doing that is because we're going through all of this trauma therapy. And when we get done with our trauma therapy, the last relationship we have to repair is the relationship with the earth, right? But we're working on our relationships with each other right now, and that's a necessary first step.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
second step, or whatever step it is. It's a lot of steps. That was a pretty meandering answer to your question, Tia. I'm sorry, but you ask big questions.
That's fine. That's
deserve-
fine. And my big question deserved as much meander and as much bigness as you could muster. So thank you. I appreciate it.
It's the thing, like perspective is so hard in the chaos of the world right now. That's the chaos is necessary for us to have these big transformative changes, but it makes it so challenging for us to actually have perspective and keep things in context.
Right.
Which is why that seeing this as the bargaining phase of grief, providing that sort of narrative structure or to context, I should say, to what's happening is so important.
Yeah.
For us to maintain our sanity and not be riven by the buffets of climate trauma. And then that, of course, also gets us, in order to have that perspective, we have to be grounded in ourselves. So it sort of brings it back down to the level of what can I do in my life,
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciate that. That is the realm of this body of work that I'm messing around with, is to really bring support and resources to people who are bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. It's really that simple. That's the elevator pitch for the body of work. And I'm curious, I think I read in one of your emails that you might be drawing your legal practice to a close.
Actually, it ended yesterday.
All right. Well, congratulations.
Much to my surprise, I thought I had another case to do, but the Montana Bar Association had other ideas. And they were going to force me to do a bunch of nonsense legal education with the pandemic going and whatever. But yeah, I actually have brought my legal career to a close. It's still sinking in. That I'm so happy to be done with that, because this is all, I mean, my whole legal career has been defending wildlife and wild lands.
Yes.
But we lost that. We've lost that fight.
Yeah.
And especially since Trump has stacked all the federal courts with judges, there's no protection left. So that's why I'm so glad to be sort of released from those front lines, because what's happening at the higher level is what has to happen in order for us to go back and repair the damage that we've done.
Yeah.
And to our laws. The laws are all kind of no longer working. So, yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing about that. And I hope it's welcome for me to say congratulations to you for being able to transition and let that go and move into the next, I'm sure, extraordinarily fruitful chapter of life. And I'm wondering, do you mind if I just ask a bit about, I already, I'm moved, and I don't want to spend time here, but I'm so appreciating that brief summary that you gave about what you're seeing is the current state of affairs that we've evolved ourselves or devolved ourselves into, in terms of standing for the commons, standing for Earth in terms of our legal system and so on. I'm curious if there's anything that you could tell us about that is at all inspiring, at all offers some sense of forward movement or movement in a good way to connect otherwise deep adversarial populations, like the different sides of these legal issues that you've been working. I'm just curious, as you look back over your career, and especially recently, is there any good news to relay? Is there anything that kind of gives you a little bit of reassurance of some of the goodness of human beings in this in this challenging time?
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.